Welcome to another video on stories of our history. Today, we embark on a journey into the very architecture of the human soul's ultimate destiny, a journey that will take us to the radiant, celestial palaces of paradise and the terrifying, abyssal pits of hell. We are going to uncover the hidden, ancient matrix from which the most powerful and enduring concepts of the Western religious imagination were born. For billions of people across the globe, the belief in a final judgment, a heavenly reward for the righteous, and a hellish punishment for the wicked is a fundamental, non-negotiable pillar of their faith, a divine assurance that the universe is, at its deepest level, a moral and a just place. But this grand, cosmic drama of salvation and damnation did not emerge, fully formed and without precedent, from the pages of the Bible or the Quran. Its earliest, most complete, and most philosophically sophisticated articulation is to be found in the teachings of an ancient, and often forgotten, prophet, Zarathustra, the founder of Zoroastrianism, a faith that flourished on the Iranian plateau and within the mighty Persian Empire for over 1,000 years before the birth of Christ. It was Zarathustra who first, with a radical and revolutionary clarity, conceived of the afterlife not as a shadowy, immoral underworld of dust and silence, but as a perfectly just, ethical system, a direct, and inescapable, consequence of a person's freely chosen thoughts, words, and deeds during their earthly life. The Zoroastrian vision of a journey across a perilous bridge, a personal confrontation with the embodiment of one's own conscience, and a final consignment to a luminous paradise or a foul, dark hell, was not merely a minor, regional belief. It was the grand cosmic template, the powerful, and deeply influential, matrix from which the later, more familiar, Abrahamic concepts of heaven and hell would eventually be cast. This is the story of that magnificent, and often unacknowledged, legacy, a story of how a single, ancient, Persian prophet gave the world its map of the eternal. The religious landscape of the ancient world, before Zarathustra's revolutionary, spiritual, upheaval, offered its inhabitants a grim, and deeply unappealing, vision of the afterlife, a vision that was devoid of any meaningful, ethical judgment, or any real sense of individual, moral consequence. The great, polytheistic civilizations of Mesopotamia, Egypt, and archaic Greece, for all their magnificent temples, their sophisticated art, and their complex, social structures, conceived of the realm of the dead as a largely, undifferentiated, and profoundly, depressing, place, a shadowy, subterranean, cavern of dust, silence, and forgetfulness. The Mesopotamian underworld, the land of no return, as it was called, was ruled by the dark goddess Ereshkigal, and it was a place where the spirits of the dead, both kings and slaves, heroes and villains, existed in a miserable, ghostly half-life, eating clay and drinking muddy water, their only comfort the ritual offerings of their living descendants. The Egyptian afterlife, with its elaborate and costly rituals of mummification and its magical spells of the Book of the Dead, was somewhat more complex, offering the possibility of a blessed existence in the field of reeds for those who passed the terrifying judgment of Osiris. But this was a fate that was largely dependent on the correct performance of arcane rituals and the personal wealth of the deceased, rather than on a clear and universal standard of ethical behavior. And the early Greek concept of Hades, a misty and gloomy realm of shadowy wraiths, offered little comfort or hope, a place where the souls of even the greatest heroes, like Achilles, longed for the warmth and the vitality of the living world. In none of these ancient systems was there a consistent and deeply internalized connection between the moral quality of a person's earthly life and the nature of their eternal destination, a connection that was, for Zarathustra, the absolute and non-negotiable foundation of his entire religious vision. The prophet Zarathustra, whose exact historical dates are still a matter of intense scholarly debate but who is now generally placed by linguists in the late Bronze Age, between 1500 and 1000 BC, in the remote eastern regions of the Iranian world, completely and radically overturned this ancient and bleak consensus. In the 17 sublime and intensely personal hymns known as the Gathas, which are the oldest and most authentic core of the Avesta, the Zoroastrian sacred scripture, Zarathustra laid out a new and revolutionary, cosmic vision, a vision of a universe that was fundamentally and eternally divided between two opposing moral forces: the principle of Asha, the truth, the light, the order, and the life, which was championed by the one, all-good creator, Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord, and the principle of the Druj, the lie, the darkness, the chaos, and the death, which was led by the malevolent, destructive spirit, Andromenu. The human being, in this profound and deeply dramatic cosmology, was not a passive, helpless victim of fate, nor a mere, ritualistic automaton. He or she was a free, conscious, and morally responsible agent, a soldier in the cosmic war whose every thought, every word, and every deed was a conscious and deliberate choice that aligned the soul with one side or the other. The Gathas speak of the ultimate destiny of the soul in terms of a journey, a crossing, and a final and eternal dwelling place. Zarathustra sings of the Chinvat Bridge, the bridge of the separator, and of the house of song, the Garo Demana, the radiant paradise of Ahura Mazda, and he alludes, with a stark and terrifying language, to the house of the lie, the Drujo Demana, the abyss of darkness and torment that awaits the followers of the Druj. The seed of the Zoroastrian heaven and hell, the first, fully articulated, ethical, afterlife in human history, was planted, and it would, over the coming centuries and millennia, grow into a vast and deeply influential tree of spiritual and moral thought. The core, and the most revolutionary, innovation of Zarathustra's eschatological vision was the absolute and non-negotiable link between the individual's personal, ethical choices and their ultimate, eternal destiny, a link that made the afterlife a matter of direct, personal, and terrifying responsibility. The prophet did not speak of a judgment that was based on the performance of elaborate and costly funerary rituals, or on the recitation of magical spells, or on the social status or the political power of the deceased. He spoke, with a fierce and uncompromising clarity, of a judgment that was based solely and completely on the moral quality of a person's life, on the accumulated weight of their good thoughts, good words, and good deeds, versus the accumulated burden of their evil thoughts, evil words, and evil deeds. The soul, in the Zoroastrian understanding, was not a passive and empty vessel, waiting to be filled by the grace or the whim of a distant God. It was the active and self-creating author of its own eternal self, a self that was being constructed, moment by moment, choice by choice, throughout the entire span of the earthly life. The Gathas are filled with a profound and urgent sense of this personal, moral drama, a drama in which the individual soul, through its own freely willed actions, was determining its own eternal and unchangeable destiny, a destiny that would be revealed with an absolute and terrifying clarity at the moment of death. The afterlife, in this new and revolutionary Zarathustrian paradigm, was not a vague and distant hope or a dark and fearful mystery. It was a tangible and ever-present reality, a reality that was being shaped in every moment by the silent and hidden choices of the human heart, and a reality that was as certain, as predictable, and as inescapable as the rising and the setting of the sun. This profound and deeply ethical vision of the afterlife was the great and enduring gift of Zarathustra to the world, a gift that would, in the fullness of time, transform the spiritual landscape of half the globe, and that would provide the fundamental, moral architecture for the heavens and the hells of the Abrahamic West. The Zoroastrian map of the afterlife, as it was elaborated and systematized by the generations of Magian priests who followed in the prophet's wake, was a meticulously detailed and deeply hierarchical structure of cosmic justice, a structure that was designed to reflect, with a terrifying and absolute precision, the exact moral condition of every individual human soul. The journey of the soul after death, as it is described in the later Pahlavi texts, such as the Bundahishan and the visionary account of the Art of Irafnama, is a dramatic and awe-inspiring progression through a series of celestial and infernal realms, each one a direct and proportional reflection of the soul's own, self-created, spiritual nature. The first 3 days after the moment of physical death are a period of intense and solitary reflection, a liminal state in which the soul hovers near the corpse, experiencing a sensory and deeply emotional preview of its ultimate fate, a preview that is a direct result of its own inner moral condition. For the righteous, this is a time of sublime peace and joyful anticipation, filled with the sweet fragrance of flowers and the distant music of paradise. For the wicked, it is a time of mounting terror and hopeless despair, tormented by a foul stench and a freezing wind from the north, the physical manifestations of its own accumulated sins. On the dawning of the 4th day, the soul is summoned to its final and irreversible judgment, and it is drawn by an irresistible cosmic force to the foot of the great mythical mountain, the Albers, to the threshold of the Chinvat Bridge, the Bridge of Judgment, where the divine tribunal of Mitra, Zoroastrian, and Rational waits, and where the soul's eternal destiny will be decided not by an arbitrary divine decree, but by the objective and unchangeable weight of its own freely chosen earthly deeds. The Zoroastrian afterlife was not a random lottery. It was a perfectly calibrated and deeply personal journey into the consequences of the self. The divine tribunal that presides over this ultimate and terrifying judgment at the Chinvat Bridge is a magnificent and deeply symbolic representation of the cosmic law of Asha, the law of truth and order, which is the very foundation of the universe. The 3 radiant Yazatas, the adorable ones, who serve as the judges of the dead, are not stern and distant gods, but the luminous embodiments of the divine attributes of justice, wisdom, and mercy, beings who are intimately and lovingly concerned with the fate of every human soul. Mitra, the ever-watchful God of covenants, the Sun, and the all-seeing truth, is the divine prosecutor and the witness for the defense, the being who has observed, with his 1,000 eyes and his 1,000 ears, every single act of the soul's earthly life, and whose memory is perfect and absolute, a divine and living record of every truth spoken and every lie uttered. Zoroastrian, the divine messenger and the embodiment of obedience to the divine law, is the guide of the soul, the protector who leads it through the terrifying and demon-infested paths of the intermediate state, and who presides over the ritual and the spiritual dimensions of the judgment, ensuring that the proper and divinely revealed procedures are followed with absolute and flawless precision. And Rashnu, the most just, the supreme and impartial judge, is the holder of the golden scales, the divine instrument that weighs, with a sensitivity that can measure the weight of a single hair, the accumulated good and evil deeds of the deceased, determining, with a mathematical and unchallengeable accuracy, the exact balance of the soul's spiritual worth. The soul, standing before this awesome and terrifying tribunal, is completely and utterly exposed, stripped of all earthly wealth, power, and pretense, and it is measured with a cold and absolute precision by the only standard that truly matters, the quality of its own freely chosen thoughts, words, and deeds. The judgment is a revelation, not a verdict. The central and most psychologically profound moment of this judgmental process is not the external weighing of the deeds, but the direct, personal, and utterly devastating encounter with the Dina, the celestial and eternal embodiment of one's own personal conscience, a figure who appears to the soul just before it attempts the great and final crossing. The Dina is not a separate, angelic, or demonic entity. She is, in the most literal and the most terrifying sense, the soul's own true and complete self, the entire accumulated sum of its earthly thoughts, words, and deeds, now made visible, tangible, and physically and inescapably present. For the righteous soul, the follower of Asha, the Dina appears as a magnificent and radiantly beautiful maiden, a being of dazzling and celestial perfection, surrounded by a sweet an intoxicating fragrance, the very scent of virtue and divine love, and she speaks, with a voice that is like the most beautiful and harmonious music, to welcome the soul to its eternal home. For the wicked soul, the follower of the Druj, the Dina appears as a hideous, foul-smelling, and terrifying hag, a grotesque and repulsive old crone whose appearance is a sickening and accurate reflection of the ugliness, the corruption, and the moral decay that the soul has cultivated throughout its earthly life, and her voice, which is like the harsh and mocking caw of a carrion crow, seals the soul's eternal and terrible fate. The Dina is the ultimate and the most terrifying moment of self-confrontation, a moment when the soul is forced, without any possibility of evasion or self-deception, to gaze into the mirror of its own eternal being, and to see, with an absolute and unflinching clarity, the face of the person it has truly and irrevocably become. The soul is, in the end, judged by the self it has created, and that judgment is absolute and inescapable for all eternity. This radical internalization of the judgment was a profound and unique Zoroastrian contribution to the history of human moral thought, a contribution that would, in transformed and adapted forms, echo through the eschatologies of the later Abrahamic faiths. Having passed the trial of the Dina and the weighing of its deeds, the soul is now ready, for better or for worse, to attempt the final and irreversible crossing of the Chinvat Bridge, the bridge of the separator, which spans the great cosmic abyss between the material and the spiritual realms. The bridge is not a static and unchanging physical structure. It is a living, dynamic, and deeply moral entity, a supernatural and metaphysical construct that responds, with an absolute and terrifying precision, to the spiritual state of the soul that seeks to cross it. For the righteous soul, the bridge appears as a magnificent and welcoming highway, a broad, smooth, and beautifully illuminated path that stretches, with a gentle and reassuring incline, across the dark and terrifying chasm below. The soul walks across it with a sense of complete and joyful confidence, supported and guided by its own good deeds and by the radiant presence of its beautiful Dina, and it enters, triumphantly and gloriously, into the eternal and luminous realm of the House of Song. For the wicked soul, however, the bridge is a razor's edge, a terrifyingly thin and impossibly sharp blade of cold and merciless light, a surface that offers no support, no comfort, and no possibility of a safe passage. The soul, heavily and awkwardly burdened by the immense and crushing weight of its own unrepented sins, is unable to find any footing, and the foul and freezing wind of its own evil deeds, which is the very breath of the demonic forces, rips it from the bridge and casts it, shrieking in an eternal and hopeless terror, into the immense, dark, and bottomless abyss of the house of the lie. The Chinvat Bridge is the ultimate and the most perfect symbol of the Zoroastrian doctrine of free will and personal responsibility, a symbol that reveals, with a terrifying and absolute clarity, that the soul's eternal destiny is not a matter of arbitrary fate or divine caprice, but the direct, inevitable, and self-created consequence of its own freely chosen earthly life. The crossing of the bridge is the final and irrevocable act of the soul's self-judgment, an act that is both the ultimate terror for the damned and the ultimate triumph for the saved. The Zoroastrian paradise, the Garo Damana, the House of Song, is not a single, static, or undifferentiated realm of vague and passive bliss. It is a magnificent and deeply structured celestial hierarchy, a luminous and ascending journey into the very heart of the divine, that is perfectly calibrated to reflect the specific, ethical, and spiritual achievements of the righteous soul. The soul that has safely and joyfully crossed the broad and welcoming Chinvat Bridge does not simply arrive at a final and unchanging destination. It embarks upon a majestic and awe-inspiring ascent through a series of 4 distinct and progressively more radiant levels of heaven, each of which is associated with a specific celestial body and a specific degree of spiritual perfection. and each of which represents a deeper and more intimate communion with Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord. This structured cosmology of the heavens, which is most fully described in the later Pahlavi texts, particularly the Arta-Virafnama, is a direct and tangible reflection of the Zoroastrian belief that the quality of the afterlife is a precise and proportional consequence of the quality of the earthly life, a belief that extends, with a beautiful and meticulous logic, from the grand cosmic scale of the final judgment down to the finest and most subtle gradations of the soul's eternal reward. The paradise of the Zoroastrians was not a one-size-fits-all reward. It was a personalized and infinitely progressive experience of the divine, a journey that was, in its very essence, a continuation and a glorious fulfillment of the soul's own unique and freely chosen path of righteousness. The house of song was not a place of idle rest, but a realm of dynamic and eternal spiritual growth, a realm where the soul's capacity for joy, for wisdom, and for loving communion with the divine was forever and limitlessly expanding, a radiant and unending homecoming to the light. The first and lowest level of this magnificent celestial ascent is the star station, the Hamada, or good thoughts realm, a place of serene and gentle beauty, where the souls who have cultivated a pure and righteous mind, and who have striven, however imperfectly, to follow the path of truth, are bathed in the soft and comforting light of the stars, a light that is the celestial reflection of their own inner spiritual radiance. This is the realm of the beginner, of the soul whose earthly struggle was sincere but whose understanding of the divine truth was perhaps incomplete or imperfectly realized, a place of gentle and loving purification, where the soul is gradually and joyfully prepared for the greater and more intense glories that lie ahead. The soul in the star station experiences a profound and satisfying peace, a sense of well-earned rest and contentment, and it begins to acclimate to the intense and ever-increasing light of the divine realm, shedding the last, lingering, and subtle impurities of its earthly sojourn. The second and higher level of paradise is the moon station, the Hukta, or good words realm, a place of more concentrated and more brilliant light, where the souls who have not only thought good thoughts but also spoken good words, whose speech on earth was a source of truth, justice, and comfort to others, are blessed with a correspondingly greater and more intimate experience of the divine. Here, the soul's capacity for joy, for understanding, and for loving communion with the other blessed souls is greatly expanded, and the beautiful and harmonious music of the house of song, the celestial symphony of praise to Ahura Mazda, becomes more audible, more moving, and more deeply transformative. The ascent through these successive celestial stations is a direct and proportional reward, a perfect and loving reflection of the specific ethical achievements of the individual soul, a testimony to the Zoroastrian belief that every thought, word, and deed, no matter how small or hidden, has an eternal and measurable spiritual significance. The third and penultimate level of the Zoroastrian heaven is the sun station, the Varshta, or good deeds realm, the abode of the most exalted and most perfectly righteous souls, those who have, throughout their earthly lives, been the tireless and courageous warriors of the light, the active and selfless servants of the good creation, and the living embodiments of the divine will on earth. This is the realm of the brilliant and life-giving solar light, the pure and radiant glory of the Kvarsh, the sun, which is the most powerful and the most sacred of all the visible celestial bodies, the earthly and cosmic symbol of Ahura Mazda himself. The souls who dwell in the sun station are filled with an indescribable and overwhelming joy, a sense of complete and perfect fulfillment, and a radiant and glorious energy that is a direct and immediate participation in the divine and creative power of the wise Lord. They are the closest companions of the Amshaspentas, the bounteous immortals, and they stand in the celestial hierarchy just below the supreme and infinite light of the Gerodman itself. The fourth, and highest, level of heaven, the ultimate, and eternal, paradise, is the Gerodman itself, the house of song. The realm of the infinite, and boundless, light of Ahura Mazda, the dwelling place of the Supreme, God and His most exalted, divine, attendants, the Ain Shah Spentas, a realm of such transcendent, and indescribable, perfection that no human tongue can adequately describe its beauty, its peace, or its eternal and unending joy. The righteous soul, having ascended through the lower 3 stations, enters, at last, into this supreme and glorious realm, and it is absorbed, completely and eternally, into the infinite and loving light of the wise Lord, a state of perfect and eternal union with the divine that is the ultimate and glorious destiny of the human soul. The Zoroastrian paradise, in its magnificent and meticulously structured hierarchy, was a celestial mirror of the ethical life, a mirror that reflected, with an exact and beautiful precision, the soul's own, hard-won, spiritual perfection. The descent of the wicked soul into the abyssal and eternal darkness of the Drujo Demana, the house of the lie, is a correspondingly structured and terrifying journey through a hierarchy of suffering and despair, a journey that is a perfect and horrific mirror image of the ascent of the righteous through the stations of light. The Zoroastrian hell is not a single, undifferentiated pit of fire and brimstone, it is a carefully graded and deeply symbolic system of punishments, each level designed to reflect, with a terrifying and precise justice, the specific nature and the severity of the sins that the soul committed during its earthly life. The soul, after its long and terrifying fall from the razor's edge of the Chinvat Bridge, plunges into the outermost and least terrible of these infernal realms, a place of heavy and oppressive darkness, of biting and constant cold, and of a profound and aching sense of isolation and loneliness, a place where the soul begins to grasp the full and terrible reality of its eternal separation from the divine light and from the loving community of the righteous. As the soul descends deeper and deeper into the heart of the house of the lie, the torments increase in intensity and in horror, becoming ever more personalized and ever more specifically tailored to the particular sins and the particular vices that the soul cultivated during its earthly life. The foul stench of decay and filth, which is the very odor of the accumulated sins of the damned, becomes more nauseating, the biting cold becomes more intense, the suffocating darkness becomes more absolute, and the cacophony of shrieks, moans, and despairing cries becomes a constant and maddening soundtrack of eternal and hopeless misery. The demons, the devas, who are the personifications of these sins, are the relentless and gleeful torturers, and the environment itself, the physical and spiritual fabric of hell, seems to be a living, malevolent, and conscious entity that actively and joyfully participates in the eternal suffering of the damned. The house of the lie is the ultimate and eternal monument to the cosmic law of Asha, a terrifying and inescapable testament to the reality that every choice has a consequence, and that a life lived in service of the Druj will, inevitably and eternally, lead to a state of absolute and self-inflicted suffering, a state that is, for all its terror, the perfectly and terribly just outcome of the soul's own, freely willed and deeply cherished evil. The profound and merciful Zoroastrian concept of Hamistigan, the place of the mixed ones, or the station of the equal, introduces a crucial and theologically significant third and intermediary state into the seemingly stark and binary eschatological framework, a state that perfectly embodies the fate's commitment to a nuanced and exquisitely just cosmic order. The soul whose good and evil deeds are found by the golden scales of Rashnu to be an exact and perfect balance, a soul whose life has been a mixture of virtue and vice, of righteousness and sin, a life that has not been sufficiently good to merit the immediate joys of paradise, but that has not been sufficiently evil to warrant the immediate torments of hell, is not, in the Zoroastrian system, subjected to an arbitrary or a random fate. It is, instead, assigned to a special and temporary state, a place of suspension and waiting, known as Hemistigan. This realm, which is located, according to the later Pahlavi texts, in a liminal space between the earth and the celestial spheres, is a place of neither joy nor torment, a place of gray and neutral existence, where the soul waits, in a state of quiet and contemplative suspension, for the final and universal resolution of the cosmic drama, the great Frashokereti, the final renovation of the world. The inhabitants of Hemistigan do not suffer the physical and spiritual agonies of hell, but neither do they experience the radiant and joyful bliss of heaven. They exist in a state of passive and patient waiting, their ultimate destiny hanging in the perfect and delicate balance of the divine justice, a balance that will only be finally and eternally resolved at the end of time, when the great purifying fire of the Frashokereti sweeps across the cosmos, purging all remaining imperfection and restoring the entire creation to its original, pristine, and eternal state of perfection. The concept of Hemistigan is a magnificent and deeply humane element of the Zoroastrian eschatology, a recognition that the moral complexity of human life cannot always be neatly divided into the simple categories of good and evil, and a promise that divine justice will, in the fullness of time, find a perfectly just and merciful resolution for every soul, no matter how mixed or how contradictory its earthly record may have been. It is a waiting room for the final and universal reconciliation, a testament to the infinite and precise justice of Ahura Mazda. This nuanced and deeply merciful conception of a temporary and neutral state for the morally balanced soul stands in stark and significant contrast to the dominant eschatological paradigms of many other ancient and later religious traditions, which often divided the dead into only two absolute and eternal categories, the blessed and the damned, the sheep and the goats, with no room for a middle ground. The ancient Greek underworld of Hades, for example, was largely an undifferentiated realm of shadows, with only a few exceptional figures, such as the great hero Heracles or the blessed initiates of the mystery cults, being granted a special and separate destiny. The early Jewish Sheol was, similarly, a place of gloomy and silent forgetfulness for all the dead, regardless of their earthly conduct, a concept that would only gradually and significantly transform under the influence of Zoroastrian ideas during the Persian and Hellenistic periods. The later Christian and Islamic traditions would develop their own complex and nuanced theologies of an intermediate state, such as the Catholic doctrine of purgatory, a place of temporary and purifying suffering for those who die in a state of grace but with unrepented venial sins, a concept that owes a deep and often unacknowledged debt to the Zoroastrian Hemistigan. The Zoroastrian vision of a precise and tripartite moral accounting, a system that recognized the reality of a life that is neither purely saintly nor purely villainous, and that provided a just and proportionate resolution for such a life, was a sophisticated and deeply humane contribution to the human understanding of divine justice, a contribution that would, in its own subtle and indirect ways, shape the later and more familiar landscapes of the Western afterlife. The scales of Rashnu were calibrated to measure not just the grand gestures of heroism and villainy, but the quiet and mixed moral reality of the ordinary human heart, and the Hemistigan was the waiting room for that reality's final and merciful resolution. The ultimate and glorious destiny of all souls, both the righteous and the wicked, the blessed of paradise and the tormented of hell, and even the suspended souls of Hemistigan, is to be fully and completely purified, renewed, and reunited in a single and eternal state of perfection at the end of the great cosmic war, the Frashokereti, the making wonderful. This final renovation of the world is the central and most glorious promise of the Zoroastrian faith, the ultimate and triumphant victory of Ahura Mazda over the forces of Ngramenu, the destructive spirit. At this climactic and world-shattering moment, the dead will be resurrected, their souls reunited with their perfected and immortal bodies, and the entire creation will be purified by a great river of molten metal, a cosmic and purifying fire that will sweep across the earth, burning away every last trace of evil, decay, and suffering. For the righteous, who have already been purified by a lifetime of ethical living, this fire will feel like a warm and comforting bath of milk. For the wicked, who have been suffering in the terrible, but ultimately redemptive torments of the house of the lie, this final fire will be the ultimate and healing purification, a painful but merciful cleansing that will burn away all of their remaining sin and restore their souls to a state of pristine and original purity, a state that they deliberately and tragically lost through their own evil choices. The Zoroastrian hell is not, therefore, a place of eternal and hopeless damnation, but a place of terrible, but necessary, and ultimately redemptive suffering, a divine and cosmic hospital for the soul, a place where the sickness of the lie is treated with a painful but effective cure, so that the patient, the soul, may be healed, and may be made whole, and may be restored, in the fullness of time, to the eternal and loving community of the righteous. The ultimate Zoroastrian vision of the end of time is a vision of universal reconciliation and eternal harmony, a glorious and joyful homecoming for all of humanity, a final and complete victory of the light that is the eternal and unconquerable hope of the faith of Zarathustra, a hope that burns, like the sacred fire on the altar, with an eternal and unquenchable flame. The striking and undeniable parallels between this Zoroastrian, eschatological schema and the later and more familiar concepts of heaven, hell, judgment, and a final, purifying fire in the Abrahamic traditions are too numerous and too precise to be dismissed as mere coincidence, and they have been a source of intense scholarly fascination and debate for over a century. The Zoroastrian vision of a structured and hierarchical paradise of light, a dark and graded hell of torment, a razor-sharp bridge of judgment, a divine tribunal that weighs the soul's deeds, a personification of the soul's own conscience as a beautiful maiden or a hideous hag, a temporary and neutral state for the morally balanced, and a final, universal conflagration that purifies and renews the entire creation, is a complete and deeply coherent eschatological system that predates by many centuries the first appearances of these fully developed concepts in the Jewish, Christian, and Islamic scriptures. The Jewish people, who lived for 2 crucial centuries under the rule of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, the dominant political and cultural power of the age, were intimately and unavoidably exposed to the Zoroastrian religious ideas, and this period of intense cultural and intellectual contact, the period of the Babylonian exile and its aftermath, was the very crucible in which the Hebrew Bible was edited, expanded, and given much of its final form, and in which the Jewish understanding of the afterlife, of judgment, and of the final destiny of the soul underwent a radical and transformative development, a development that bears, at every stage, the unmistakable and profound imprint of the Zoroastrian model. The Persian matrix of the afterlife, which was first conceived by the prophet Zarathustra on the ancient steps and which was elaborated and systematized by the Magian priesthood under the mighty Persian empires, was a powerful and deeply persuasive spiritual map, a map that would, over the coming centuries, be copied, adapted, and transformed by the scribes, the prophets, and the theologians of the emerging Abrahamic faiths, becoming the fundamental and enduring architecture of the heavens and the hells of the entire Western world. The Zoroastrian afterlife was not just a belief, it was a blueprint that was destined to shape the spiritual destiny of billions, and to provide the moral and cosmic framework for the fears, the hopes, and the ultimate longings of humanity for over 2,500 years. The critical and transformative period of contact between the Zoroastrian religious world and the Jewish people, the moment when the powerful and sophisticated Persian, eschatological matrix first began to flow into the stream of the Abrahamic tradition was the era of the Babylonian exile and its long and complex aftermath. A period that stretched from the destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar II in 586 BC to the rise of Alexander the Great in the late 4th century BC. For over 2 centuries, the Jewish elite, the priests, the scribes, the prophets, and the royal family lived under the direct and often benevolent rule of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, a state whose official ideology was deeply and proudly rooted in the worship of Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, the very god of Zarathustra, and whose court and administrative apparatus were dominated by the Magi, the powerful and learned Zoroastrian priestly caste. This was not a period of harsh and repressive subjugation, but a time of relative peace, prosperity, and cultural exchange, a time when the Jewish community, which was deeply grateful to Cyrus the Great for his decree allowing them to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple, was intimately and respectfully engaged with the religious and the intellectual life of their Persian overlords. The books of the Hebrew Bible that were composed, edited, and given their final form during and immediately after this Persian period, such as the books of Isaiah, Ezekiel, Zechariah, Daniel, and Ezra, reveal, with a dramatic and unmistakable clarity, a profound transformation in the Jewish understanding of God, of the cosmos, and of the ultimate destiny of the human soul. A transformation that is directly and deeply indebted to the Zoroastrian worldview. The Persian imperial power was not just a political reality, it was a spiritual catalyst, a divine instrument, in the eyes of the biblical authors, that was used by Yahweh to shape and to purify his chosen people, and to reveal to them a new and more glorious vision of his eternal plan for the world. The most dramatic and the most theologically significant of these Zoroastrian-influenced transformations in post-exilic Judaism was the emergence of a fully developed and ethically rigorous eschatology, a detailed and systematic map of the afterlife that stands in stark and deliberate contrast to the vague and shadowy concept of Sheol, the gloomy underworld of the earlier Israelite tradition. The Book of Daniel, which was composed in its final form during the Maccabean crisis of the 2nd century BC but which draws on far older Persian period traditions, contains the first unambiguous and explicit reference in the Hebrew Bible to a bodily resurrection of the dead, a general judgment, and a final separation of the righteous, who are destined for everlasting life, and the wicked, who are destined for shame and everlasting contempt. This is a breathtaking and revolutionary development, a clear and decisive break with the ancient Israelite belief that death was the final and permanent end of all conscious existence, and a direct and powerful echo of the Zoroastrian doctrine of the Frashokereti, the final renovation of the world, when the dead will be raised, judged, and assigned to their eternal fates. The figure of the archangel Michael, the great and powerful prince who protects the people of Israel and who will arise at the end of time to lead the heavenly host against the forces of evil, is a direct, literary, and theological descendant of the Zoroastrian Yazatas, such as Mitra and Sraosha, the divine warriors who fight on behalf of the righteous and who serve as the judges and the protectors of the souls of the dead. The vision of the Ancient of Days, the majestic and awe-inspiring divine figure who sits on a fiery throne and presides over the final judgment, is a magnificent and deeply Persian-influenced image, a reflection of the supreme and transcendent majesty of Ahura Mazda, the wise Lord, who rules over the entire cosmos from his realm of infinite light. The Book of Daniel is, in many ways, a Jewish, apocalyptic text that is written in the symbolic and theological language of Zoroastrian Persia, a language that had become, during the centuries of imperial rule, the native tongue of the Jewish imagination for the final things. The complex and highly structured angelology and demonology that emerged in Jewish literature during the Second Temple period, the period of Persian and Hellenistic rule, is another, profound, and undeniable testament to the pervasive influence of the Zoroastrian, cosmic, dualism on the developing, Abrahamic, worldview. The earlier books of the Hebrew Bible speak of a divine court, the sons of God, who attend upon Yahweh, but the concept of a vast and hierarchical army of named and specialized angels, each with their own distinct function and personality, is largely absent from the pre-exilic texts. It is in the post-exilic and apocalyptic literature, the books of Zechariah, Tobit, and Enoch, that the archangels Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel, and the elaborate celestial hierarchies, the cherubim, the seraphim, and the 7 holy angels who stand before the throne of God, first make their dramatic and detailed appearance, a literary and theological phenomenon that is a direct and unmistakable reflection of the Zoroastrian, Ain Shaspentas, the bounteous immortals, and the Yazatas, the adorable ones, who serve Ahura Mazda. Even more striking is the radical transformation of the figure of Satan, the adversary, from the subordinate and divinely sanctioned prosecuting attorney of the heavenly court, as he appears in the early chapters of the book of Job, into the fully demonized and malevolent Prince of Darkness, the father of lies, and the implacable and eternal enemy of God and humanity, a figure who is the direct and unmistakable conceptual descendant of the Zoroastrian and Ramenu, the destructive spirit. The cosmic dualism of the Zoroastrian faith, the sharp and uncompromising division of the entire universe into the opposing camps of a pure and all-good God and a powerful and independent force of absolute evil, a division that was, as we have seen, the very foundation of the Zoroastrian eschatological system, was a revolutionary and deeply compelling idea that, once it had entered the Jewish consciousness during the Persian period, could never be fully eradicated. It would, in the fullness of time, be inherited and further transformed by both Christianity and Islam, becoming the fundamental and defining framework of the Western religious understanding of the nature of good and evil, and the ultimate and eternal destiny of the human soul. The devils and the angels of the Abrahamic West are, in a very real and traceable, historical sense, the divas and the yazatas of ancient Persia, reborn and reclothed in the language of the Bible and the Quran. The profound and historically demonstrable influence of the Zoroastrian eschatological matrix on the development of the Jewish afterlife does not, however, imply a simple process of direct and uncritical borrowing or a passive and derivative imitation. The Jewish scribes, prophets, and theologians who encountered and absorbed the powerful Persian ideas were not empty vessels waiting to be filled with a foreign and alien doctrine. They were the active and creative agents of a complex process of cultural and religious synthesis, a process in which the Zoroastrian concepts were carefully selected, adapted, and transformed to fit the unique and non-negotiable monotheistic framework of the covenant faith of Israel. The Zoroastrian dualism, with its two independent and co-eternal spirits of good and evil, was ultimately and decisively rejected by Orthodox Judaism, which insisted, with an absolute and uncompromising monotheism, on the sole and uncreated sovereignty of Yahweh, the one and only God, who is the ultimate source of both light and darkness, good and calamity. The role of the human free will, which is so central and so empowering in the Zoroastrian system, was subtly, but significantly, reframed within the Jewish context, where the primary emphasis was often placed on obedience to the revealed Torah, the divine law, as the path to righteousness and the guarantee of a blessed afterlife. The Zoroastrian matrix was not a rigid and confining mold into which the Jewish faith was forcibly poured. It was, rather, a rich and suggestive quarry of ideas, a source of powerful and evocative images and concepts that the Jewish tradition used, with a remarkable and creative freedom, to construct its own unique and enduring vision of the final judgment, the resurrection of the dead, and the eternal destiny of the soul. The result was a magnificent and original synthesis, a new and distinctly Jewish eschatology that was, at the same time, deeply and permanently indebted to the prophetic genius of Zarathustra and the priestly wisdom of the Magi, a synthesis that would, in its turn, become the foundation for the heavens and the hells of the Christian and the Islamic worlds. The emergence of early Christianity from the rich and complex matrix of Second Temple Judaism, a Judaism that had been, as we have seen, deeply and permanently shaped by centuries of contact with the Zoroastrian eschatological tradition, meant that the new messianic faith of Jesus of Nazareth was, from its very inception, the direct and unwitting heir to the ancient Persian map of the afterlife. The Jewish world into which Jesus was born, and in which his earliest followers lived, preached, and wrote, was a world that was already thoroughly saturated with the Zoroastrian influenced concepts of a final judgment, a resurrection of the dead, a messianic savior who would defeat the forces of evil, a cosmic battle between the armies of God and the legions of a powerful and malevolent devil, and a clear and decisive separation of the righteous, who would be rewarded with eternal life in a heavenly paradise, and the wicked, who would be condemned to the eternal torments of a fiery hell. These ideas, which had been, for centuries, the common currency of Jewish apocalyptic and wisdom literature, were not obscure or esoteric doctrines. They were the very air that the early Christians breathed, the fundamental and unquestioned assumptions of their religious worldview. When Jesus spoke, in the Gospel of Matthew, of the Son of Man coming in his glory, with all the angels, and sitting on his throne of glory, to separate the nations as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats, with the righteous on his right, inheriting the kingdom prepared for them since the creation of the world, and the wicked on his left, being cast into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. He was not inventing a new and original eschatological language. He was speaking, with a profound and powerful authority, in the familiar and deeply resonant symbolic vocabulary of the Zoroastrian and the Jewish apocalyptic traditions, a vocabulary that his audience would have instantly recognized and understood, a vocabulary that had been shaped, centuries earlier, by the prophetic vision of Zarathustra on the ancient steps and by the meticulous priestly elaborations of the Magi under the mighty Persian kings. The Christian heaven and hell were, from the beginning, the Zoroastrian heaven and hell, reborn in a new and radically transformed Christological context. The specific and vivid imagery of the Christian afterlife, particularly as it is developed in the New Testament and in the later patristic and medieval traditions, is replete with symbols and concepts that have their closest and most powerful parallels in the Zoroastrian eschatological literature, parallels that are too numerous and too detailed to be dismissed as mere random coincidence. The very word paradise, which is used by Jesus on the cross when he promises the penitent thief, "Today you will be with me in paradise," is a direct linguistic borrowing from the old Persian word paradata, meaning a walled garden, which was the term used to describe the magnificent and ordered royal hunting parks of the Achaemenid kings, and which was adopted through the Greek paradisos into the Jewish and then the Christian vocabulary for the Garden of Eden and the heavenly abode of the blessed. The Christian concept of the bosom of Abraham, a place of comfort and rest for the righteous dead who await the final resurrection, is a direct parallel to the Zoroastrian hemistagon, the intermediate and temporary state of the morally balanced soul, a place of waiting and quiet peace before the last judgment. The terrifying and magnificent vision of the last judgment in the book of Revelation, with its great white throne, its opened books of judgment, its lake of fire, and its final and eternal separation of the saved and the damned, culminating in the descent of a new and glorious heavenly Jerusalem, is a breathtaking and dramatic Christian reimagining of the Zoroastrian, Frashokereti. The final, cosmic, renovation, when the river of molten metal will purify the world and the righteous will dwell in a renewed and perfected creation bathed in the eternal light of Ahura Mazda. The figure of the Antichrist, the great and final, human embodiment of evil who will arise at the end of time to deceive the nations and to wage a terrible war against the saints, only to be defeated by the returning Christ, is a direct and unmistakable, conceptual descendant of the Zoroastrian, Saoshyant, the Messianic Savior, and his final battle against the forces of Ingramanu, the destructive spirit. The Christian apocalypse is, in its deepest and most fundamental structure, a Zoroastrian drama that has been recast with a magnificent and creative genius in the light of the cross and the resurrection of Jesus. The radical internalization and spiritualization of the Zoroastrian ethical dualism, which is one of the most significant and distinctive features of the teachings of Jesus, represents a profound and creative transformation of the ancient Persian concept of the cosmic war between Asha and the Druj. For Zarathustra, as we have seen, the great battlefield between good and evil was the entire cosmos, and every human being was a soldier who was called to fight, actively and concretely, on the side of the light, through the performance of good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. Jesus, while fully affirming this radical, ethical demand for personal righteousness, shifted the focus of the battle inward, into the hidden and secret chambers of the human heart. In the Sermon on the Mount, he intensifies the demands of the Mosaic law, declaring that the sin of murder is already committed in the heart of the person who harbors anger, and that the sin of adultery is already committed in the heart of the person who looks with lust. A radical and deeply Zoroastrian focus on the inner thought as the primary and most significant moral act. The Christian struggle against the forces of the devil and his demons, which is so central to the New Testament and to the subsequent ascetic and monastic traditions, is, in its essence, a struggle for the purification of the mind and the soul, a battle against the internal and polluting forces of hatred, greed, lust, and despair, a battle that is fought not on the grand, public stage of the empire, but in the quiet and solitary space of the individual conscience. This internalization of the cosmic war, which was already present in a nascent form in the Zoroastrian concept of the Dina, the personified conscience that greets the soul after death, was a powerful and enduring Christian contribution to the spiritual heritage of the West, a contribution that, in its deepest roots, is a direct and creative transformation of the ancient and profound ethical vision of the prophet Zarathustra. The Christian heaven and hell were not just external destinations, they were states of the soul, states that began to be experienced in a very real and tangible sense, here and now, in the silent and secret depths of the human heart. The later development of the Christian theology of the afterlife, particularly the elaborate and detailed visions of heaven, hell, and purgatory that were articulated by the Church Fathers and that reached their magnificent and terrifying, artistic, and literary zenith in Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy, represents a further and complex evolution of these ancient and deeply rooted Zoroastrian concepts, a process of cultural and theological synthesis that had been unfolding for over 1,000 years. The Catholic doctrine of purgatory, a temporary state of suffering and purification for those who die in a state of grace but who are still burdened by the stain of unrepented, venial sins, a state that must be endured before the soul can be admitted, pure and cleansed, into the beatific vision of heaven, is a direct and powerful echo of the Zoroastrian Hemistigan, the place of the mixed ones, and of the final, purifying fire of the Frashokereti, which would cleanse the wicked of their remaining evil. The magnificent and beautifully structured architecture of Dante's Inferno, with its 9 descending circles of hell, each one reserved for a specific and increasingly heinous category of sin, and its corresponding and ascending terraces of the Purgatorio, leading up to the celestial and rose-shaped perfection of the Paradiso, is a creative and deeply Christian masterpiece. But its fundamental and deeply ordered conception of a cosmos of moral physics, a universe in which every sin and every virtue has its precise and proportionate consequence in the afterlife, is a direct and profound inheritance from the Zoroastrian system of the Chinvat Bridge, the graded levels of paradise, and the corresponding depths of the house of the lie. The Christian imagination, over the course of 2 millennia, had built a magnificent and enduring cathedral of the afterlife, a cathedral that was, in its deepest and most ancient foundations, a Zoroastrian temple, a temple that had been consecrated, with a new and glorious faith, to the worship of the God who is both the judge and the redeemer of the human soul. A God whose mercy and whose justice were the eternal and unconquerable light of the world. The rise of Islam in the 7th century CE, in the vibrant and deeply contested religious and cultural landscape of the late antique Near East, brought the new and powerful monotheistic faith of the Prophet Muhammad into direct and immediate contact with the ancient and still living Zoroastrian tradition, a contact that would have a profound and lasting impact on the development of Islamic eschatology and on the rich and detailed Quranic and later Islamic visions of paradise and hell. The Arab, Muslim armies that emerged from the Arabian Peninsula and that swiftly and decisively conquered the mighty and exhausted Sasanian Persian Empire in the mid-7th century, found themselves the rulers of a vast and ancient civilization whose official state religion was Zoroastrianism, a faith that had, for over 12 centuries, been the dominant cultural and spiritual force on the Iranian plateau, and whose elaborate and deeply systematic doctrines of the afterlife, of judgment, and of the final renovation of the world were woven into the very fabric of Persian society. The Zoroastrian faithful, who were granted the status of dhimmi, a protected people, under Islamic law were allowed to practice their religion, and their learned priests, the Magi, continued to serve as the guardians of the ancient and sacred knowledge, a knowledge that included a sophisticated and centuries-old tradition of astronomy, medicine, and crucially, eschatology. The intellectual and cultural exchange between the Muslim conquerors and their new Zoroastrian subjects, which was particularly intense and productive during the early Abbasid Caliphate, a period of magnificent scientific and philosophical flourishing that was centered on the newly founded city of Baghdad, located just a few miles from the ancient Sasanian capital of Ctesiphon, created a fertile ground for the transmission and the transformation of religious ideas, a transmission that was often unconscious and indirect, but that was nonetheless deeply pervasive and historically significant. The Islamic heaven and hell, which were, of course, fundamentally and non-negotiably rooted in the divine revelation of the Quran, were, at the same time, elaborated and enriched by the deep and ancient Zoroastrian spiritual and cultural environment in which the new faith took root and grew to maturity. The Quranic descriptions of the delights of paradise, the Jannah, the garden, and the torments of hell, the Jahannam, the fiery pit, are vivid, powerful, and deeply sensory, and they bear, in many of their specific and evocative details, a striking and suggestive resemblance to the corresponding Zoroastrian concepts that had been circulating in the Near East for over a millennium. The Zoroastrian House of Song. The Garo Demana is a place of eternal light, of beautiful music, of fragrant gardens, and of the joyous company of the righteous and the divine beings, a place where the blessed soul is reunited with its loved ones and enjoys a state of perfect and unending bliss, an image that is deeply resonant with the Quranic paradise, with its flowing rivers of water, milk, and honey, its beautiful gardens, its magnificent palaces, and its dark-eyed celestial companions, the Huris, who are the pure and loving spouses of the blessed. The Zoroastrian House of the Lie. The Drujo Demana is a place of absolute and crushing darkness, of foul and nauseating stench, of biting and constant cold, and of terrifying and lonely isolation, where the damned are tormented by the very demons they served in life, a vision that shares its deep and terrifying structure with the Quranic hell, with its scorching and eternal fire, its boiling water, its foul and putrid food, and its relentless and hopeless despair. The Islamic concept of the Chinvat Bridge, the path, which is described as a terrifyingly thin and razor-sharp span that stretches across the abyss of hell and that every soul must cross on the day of judgment, a bridge that is sharper than a sword and thinner than a hair, and that the righteous, guided by their good deeds, cross with the speed of lightning, while the wicked stumble and fall into the fiery pit below, is a direct and unmistakable conceptual descendant of the Zoroastrian Chinvat Bridge, the bridge of the separator, which serves the identical and terrifying function in the Zoroastrian eschatological drama, a bridge that is wide and welcoming for the righteous and a razor's edge for the damned. The deep and structural parallels between the two traditions on the geography and the experience of the afterlife are profound, and they point, with a compelling and cumulative force, to a powerful and enduring Zoroastrian influence on the formation of the Islamic spiritual imagination. The highly developed and complex angelology and demonology of the Islamic tradition, which is a central and essential component of the faith, also owes a deep and often unacknowledged debt to the Zoroastrian model, a debt that was mediated, in part, through the earlier Jewish and Christian elaborations of these concepts, but that also, almost certainly, involved a direct and ongoing contact with the living Zoroastrian tradition in the conquered Persian territories. The Quran speaks of a vast and hierarchical host of angels, the Malaika, who are the obedient and utterly devoted servants of God, the messengers, the guardians, the recorders of human deeds, and the warriors who fight on behalf of the faithful against the forces of darkness, a celestial army that is the direct and functional equivalent of the Zoroastrian Yazadas, the adorable ones, who serve Ahura Mazda. The Islamic Iblis, the chief of the demons, who is also known as Al-Shaitan, the adversary, is a powerful and malevolent jinn who, when God commanded the angels to bow before the newly created Adam, refused, out of an arrogant and proud disobedience, and was cast out of paradise, becoming the eternal and implacable enemy of humanity, the whisperer, who insinuates evil thoughts into the hearts of men and women, a figure whose personal history and whose cosmic function are deeply and unmistakably resonant with the Zoroastrian and Ramenu, the destructive spirit, who is the source of all evil and the father of all lies. The elaborate and terrifying descriptions of the torments of the grave, the punishment that awaits the wicked soul in the period between death and the final resurrection, the questioning by the two angels, Munkar and Nakir, and the crushing of the tomb, a concept that is known as the Barzakh, the barrier, a liminal state of waiting and suffering, are a direct and powerful parallel to the Zoroastrian three-day vigil of the soul before its journey to the Chinvat Bridge, and to the temporary and purgatorial state of the Hemistigan. The Islamic cosmos, like the Zoroastrian one, was a world that was thickly populated with invisible and powerful spiritual beings, a world that was the arena of a constant and grinding war between the forces of light and darkness, a war in which every human soul was a participant, and a world in which the final and eternal destiny of that soul was determined by the choices it made and the allegiances it formed during its earthly pilgrimage. The devils and the angels of Islam are, in a very real and historical sense, the reborn and the reimagined divas and yazadas of the ancient Persian tradition, a tradition that had, by the time of the Prophet Muhammad, already shaped the spiritual landscape of the Near East for over 1,000 years. The profound and historically demonstrable influence of the Zoroastrian eschatological matrix on the development of the Islamic afterlife does not, however, in any way diminish the unique and absolute sovereignty of the Quranic revelation for the Muslim believer, nor does it reduce the Islamic faith to a mere syncretic borrowing from an older and now vanquished religion. The Quran, for the Muslim, is the direct, uncreated, and eternal Word of God, the final and most complete revelation to humanity, and the paradise and the hell that it describes are, in their essence, divine and transcendent realities that are beyond the scope of human history or cultural influence. The Zoroastrian concepts, like the Jewish and Christian ones that preceded them, were part of the vast and complex religious and cultural milieu of the late antique Near East, a milieu that provided a rich and evocative symbolic vocabulary that the Prophet Muhammad and the subsequent Islamic tradition used with a brilliant and creative genius to articulate and to elaborate the eternal truths of the divine revelation. The Zoroastrian matrix was not the source of the Islamic faith, but it was, undeniably, a powerful and pervasive part of the spiritual and intellectual environment in which that faith was born, developed, and articulated its own unique and glorious vision of the final judgment, the resurrection, and the eternal destiny of the human soul. The heavens and the hells of Islam, like the heavens and the hells of Judaism and Christianity, are a magnificent and enduring testament to the complex and interwoven history of the human religious imagination, a history in which the prophetic voice of Zarathustra, the ancient Persian sage, played a crucial, foundational, and often unacknowledged role, a role that continues, to this day, to shape the ultimate hopes and the deepest fears of billions of the faithful across the globe. The Zoroastrian flame of judgment and of hope, which was first kindled on the steppes of Central Asia over 3,000 years ago, is still burning in the very heart of the Abrahamic world, a silent and eternal witness to the enduring and unconquerable power of the ancient Persian vision of the cosmic war between good and evil, a war whose final and glorious outcome will determine the destiny of every soul that has ever lived. The profound and historically demonstrable influence of the Zoroastrian eschatological matrix on the development of the Abrahamic afterlife should not, however, be misconstrued as a simple and linear process of direct and uncritical borrowing, a kind of religious photocopying in which the later faith simply replicated the Persian model. The reality, as is always the case in the complex and messy history of cultural and religious exchange, was a far more nuanced and deeply creative process of adaptation, transformation, and independent, organic development, a process in which the Zoroastrian ideas served as a powerful and suggestive catalyst, but were then, fundamentally, reshaped and reinterpreted within the unique and non-negotiable theological frameworks of the emerging monotheistic traditions. Each of the three great Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, possessed a rigid and absolute core of divine revelation and a developing body of sacred scripture, tradition, and law that could not be simply set aside in favor of a foreign and pagan system, no matter how sophisticated or how appealing that system might be. The process was, therefore, one of selective absorption, critical reevaluation, and creative synthesis, a process in which the Zoroastrian concepts were, in effect, baptized and made to serve the theological and the moral purposes of the new and exclusive covenant between the one true God and his chosen people, or his universal church, or his final and most perfect community of believers. The heavens and the hells of the Abrahamic West are not, therefore, simply the Zoroastrian house of song and house of the lie with new and biblical names. They are distinct and organically developed theological realities that have been built, with the aid of the Persian architectural tools, upon the solid and independent foundations of the Jewish, the Christian, and the Islamic revelations. The Persian matrix was a quarry, not a finished building, and the great Abrahamic cathedrals of the afterlife were constructed, with a unique and glorious creativity, by the inspired hands of the prophets, the apostles, and the theologians of the New and world-changing faiths. The most fundamental, and the most theologically significant, point of divergence between the Zoroastrian and the Abrahamic systems, the point at which the later traditions felt compelled, by the very core of their monotheistic faith, to alter, and even to reject, the Persian model, concerns the ultimate and absolute sovereignty of God over the forces of good and evil. The Zoroastrian dualism, as we have explored throughout this series, is a qualified and temporary dualism, a cosmic war between two independent and primordial spirits, Spenta Manu, the Holy Spirit of Ahura Mazda, and Indra Manu, the destructive spirit, a war that will, ultimately, be won by the good, but that, in the present age, places a real and significant limitation on the power of the wise Lord. This vision of a universe that is, in its very essence, a battleground between two opposing and co-eternal principles was, for the strict and uncompromising monotheism of the Abrahamic faiths, a profound and unacceptable challenge to the absolute and uncreated sovereignty of the one true God, who is, in the words of the Hebrew prophets, the creator of both light and darkness, the maker of peace and the author of calamity, and who is, in the Christian and Islamic confessions, the omnipotent and all-knowing Lord of all the worlds, from whom nothing can be hidden and without whose will no event, either good or evil, can occur. The figure of Satan, in the Abrahamic traditions, however powerful and however malevolent he may be, is never an independent and co-eternal rival to God. He is a fallen creature, a rebel angel who owes his very existence to the divine, creative will, and whose ultimate defeat and eternal punishment are, from the beginning, an absolute and divinely decreed certainty. The Zoroastrian dualism, which was a brilliant and deeply compelling answer to the problem of evil, was ultimately and decisively rejected by the monotheistic mainstream of the Abrahamic West in favor of a radical and uncompromising affirmation of the single and absolute sovereignty of the one and only God, a God who is not and can never be locked in a struggle with an equal and opposing power. The Persian matrix was, at this crucial point, shattered, and a new and distinctly Abrahamic solution to the problem of evil, a solution that was rooted in the mystery of divine providence and the hope of a final and complete redemption, was forged in its place. The specific, and often vividly detailed, elements of the Zoroastrian afterlife, the Chinvat Bridge, the Dina, the Hemistigan, the river of molten metal, were not, for the most part, directly and literally adopted by the Abrahamic traditions, but they were, instead, adapted, transformed, and given new and theologically appropriate meanings within the new scriptural and doctrinal contexts. The image of the Bridge of Judgment, for example, which is so central and so terrifying in the Zoroastrian eschatology, reappears in a transformed and spiritualized form in the Islamic Sirat, but it is largely absent from the mainstream Jewish and Christian traditions, which develop their own unique metaphors for the final judgment, such as the great white throne of the Apocalypse, or the weighing of the soul by the archangel Michael. The Zoroastrian Dina, the beautiful maiden, or the hideous hag, who is the personification of the soul's own conscience, is a unique and deeply psychological concept that has no exact parallel in the Abrahamic texts, but its underlying ethical principle, the idea that the soul is judged by its own deeds and that it must confront the true and naked reality of its own moral self, is a theme that is central to the teachings of Jesus and to the prophetic calls for repentance and personal responsibility that are found throughout the Bible and the Quran. The Zoroastrian Hemistigan, the temporary and neutral state of the morally balanced, finds its closest Abrahamic parallel in the Catholic doctrine of purgatory, a state of post-mortem purification that is, for the Christian, essential for the soul that is destined for heaven but is not yet perfectly sanctified, a concept that has no real place in the strict binary eschatology of traditional Protestantism, or of mainstream Sunni or Shia Islam, which generally affirm the immediate and eternal consignment of the soul to paradise or hell after the particular judgment. The Zoroastrian matrix was, therefore, not a rigid and unyielding template, but a vast and suggestive reservoir of images and ideas, a reservoir from which the Abrahamic traditions drew, with a creative and selective freedom, the elements that were compatible with their own unique and divinely revealed truths, and which they then transformed, with a magnificent and enduring spiritual genius, into the familiar and beloved landscapes of their own eternal hopes and fears. The role of Greek philosophy and Hellenistic culture as an intermediary and a catalyst in the transmission of Zoroastrian ideas to the Abrahamic world, particularly to Christianity, is a crucial and often overlooked dimension of this complex story of cultural synthesis. The conquests of Alexander the Great in the late 4th century BC, which shattered the Achaemenid Persian Empire, paradoxically opened up new and powerful channels of intellectual exchange between the East and the West, channels that were dominated for centuries by the Hellenistic culture that spread across the entire Near East. The Greek philosophers and historians, such as Herodotus, Plutarch, and Diogenes Laertius, were deeply fascinated by the figure of Zarathustra and by the teachings of the Magi, and their writings, which were widely read and studied in the Roman world, were a primary source of Western knowledge about Persian religion for over 1,000 years. The dualistic and highly ethical worldview of Zoroastrianism, with its sharp division between light and darkness, spirit and matter, good and evil, had a profound and deeply documented influence on the development of several key Greek philosophical and religious movements, including Platonism, with its theory of the eternal forms and its sharp dualism between the body and the soul. The mystery cults, with their secret rituals and their promises of a blessed afterlife for the initiated, and most significantly the various Gnostic sects of the early Christian era, which developed a radical and often heretical dualism that owed a great deal to the Zoroastrian model. These Hellenistic and Gnostic channels provided a direct and powerful conduit through which Zoroastrian ideas, often in a mixed and syncretized form, continued to flow into the intellectual bloodstream of the emerging Christian faith, shaping the theological debates of the early Church and leaving a permanent and often hidden mark on the development of the Christian concept of the soul, its fall, and its ultimate and eternal redemption. The Persian wisdom of the Magi, which had been transmitted through the patient and meticulous oral tradition of the Zoroastrian priesthood, had become, through the complex and often surprising detours of Hellenistic and Roman culture, a permanent and deeply influential part of the spiritual heritage of the Christian West. The heavens and the hells of the Abrahamic world were, in the end, a magnificent and enduring monument to a long and complex conversation between the ancient Persian prophets and the philosophers, the apostles, and the caliphs of the Mediterranean and the Near Eastern worlds, a conversation that has shaped, in profound and often unacknowledged ways, the moral and the spiritual destiny of humanity for over 2 millennia. The profound and deeply philosophical concept of moral physics that underpins the entire Zoroastrian eschatological system is the idea that the Chinvat Bridge and the judgment that it represents are not external and arbitrary events, but the direct, inevitable, and automatic consequences of the soul's own, freely chosen, state of alignment with, or opposition to, the fundamental cosmic law of Asha. The universe, in the Zoroastrian understanding, is not a morally neutral or a chaotic and random space. It is a structured and deeply meaningful cosmos, a creation that is governed, in every detail and at every level, by a single, divine, and unchanging law, the law of truth, order, and righteousness, which is Asha. This law is not a set of arbitrary and external commands imposed upon the world by a distant and authoritarian deity. It is the very fabric of reality itself, the operating system of the universe, the divine logic that underlies all of existence. And it is as absolute, as predictable, and as inescapable as the laws of physics, chemistry, and mathematics. The soul, in the Zoroastrian view, is a spiritual entity that is constantly and continuously interacting with this cosmic law, and every thought, word, and deed that it generates is a force, a spiritual energy, that either aligns it with Asha, strengthening its connection to the divine light, or aligns it with the Druj, the anti-law, the cosmic principle of falsehood, chaos, and decay, which separates it from the divine source and plunges it into the darkness of spiritual non-being. The Chinvat Bridge is the ultimate and perfect instrument of this moral physics, a spiritual technology that measures, with an absolute and terrifying precision, the exact state of the soul's alignment with Asha, and that manifests as an inescapable physical and spiritual reality, the consequences of that state. The soul does not cross the bridge simply reveals, with a terrifying and eternal clarity, whether the soul has built, through its own freely chosen actions, the spiritual substance that is necessary to reach the divine light, or whether it has, by its own neglect and wickedness, condemned itself to the abyss. The judgment is not a verdict, it is a revelation of an eternal and self-created fact. This radical and deeply internalized understanding of the judgment of the soul has profound and immensely empowering implications for the way that the individual Zoroastrian believer approaches his or her daily life, transforming every moment of existence into an arena of cosmic and eternal significance. If the state of one's soul after death is determined not by an arbitrary, divine decree, but by the accumulated and tangible, spiritual substance of one's own freely chosen thoughts, words, and deeds, then every single choice, no matter how small or how private, is a matter of absolute and eternal importance. The casual, unkind word, the convenient, but dishonest, business deal, the selfish and uncharitable thought, the refusal to stand up for the truth in a moment of moral crisis, all of these are not just minor, ethical failings, they are active and deliberate contributions to the soul's own spiritual decay, a decay that will, at the moment of death, be made terrifyingly and eternally manifest on the Chinvat Bridge. Conversely, every act of kindness, every word of truth, every gesture of compassion, every courageous defense of the weak and the oppressed, every moment of sincere and selfless devotion to Ahura Mazda, is a direct and tangible investment in the soul's eternal future, a building block of the solid and magnificent bridge that will, on the dawning of the fourth day, carry the righteous soul safely and joyfully into the eternal light. The Zoroastrian doctrine of the Chinvat Bridge was not designed to cripple the human spirit with fear, but to empower it with a sense of radical and profound personal responsibility, a sense that the individual human being is not a helpless pawn of fate, but the sole and absolute author of his or her own eternal destiny, a destiny that is being written in every moment by the free and conscious choices of the will. The bridge is the ultimate test of character, a test that is not passed or failed in a single dramatic moment, but is prepared for and effectively taken in every single moment of a person's entire earthly life. This profound and deeply ethical concept was the great and enduring gift of Zoroastrianism to the world, a gift that would, in transformed and adapted forms, become a central pillar of the moral systems of the Abrahamic faiths. The profound and deeply psychological terror of the Chinvat Bridge, as it is experienced by the wicked soul, lies precisely in the fact that it exposes, without any possibility of mitigation or excuse, the ultimate futility and self-destruction of a life lived in defiance of the cosmic law. The wicked soul, which has spent its entire earthly existence constructing a false and self-serving identity, justifying its cruelties, rationalizing its selfishness, and hiding its true and ugly nature behind a mask of social respectability, is, at the moment of death, stripped of all these protective illusions, and it is forced to see itself as it truly and objectively is, a creature of darkness, chaos, and the lie, a creature that is, by its very nature, incapable of crossing the bridge of truth. The terror of the bridge is the terror of absolute and final self-knowledge, the horrifying and devastating realization that one has spent a lifetime and an eternity building a self that is, in its very essence, incompatible with the divine reality, a self that is, quite literally, a negation of all that is good, true, and beautiful. The fall from the bridge is not a punishment that is inflicted upon this wretched soul from outside. It is the automatic and inevitable consequence of its own spiritual emptiness, an emptiness that is the direct and logical result of a lifetime of choosing the druj, a choice that has, in effect, consumed the soul's own spiritual substance, leaving nothing but a dark and weightless void, a void that must, by the very laws of the cosmic order, fall into the abyss of its own nothingness. The Chinvat Bridge is the great cosmic mirror, a mirror that reflects, with a terrifying and absolute clarity, the true and eternal face of the self, a face that is, for the righteous, the radiant and beautiful face of the divine, and for the wicked, the hideous and terrifying face of the demonic. It is the ultimate and final truth, a truth that no soul can escape, and a truth that every soul, in the deepest and most hidden chamber of its own heart, has always and already known. This radical and deeply ethical vision of a universe of moral cause and effect, a universe in which the soul is, quite literally, the architect of its own eternal home, was a revolutionary and profoundly influential idea, an idea that would, through the channels of Jewish, Christian, and Islamic thought, help to shape the fundamental, moral, and spiritual landscape of the entire Western world. The Zoroastrian heaven and hell were not just places, they were states of being, the final and eternal expression of the soul's own true and self-created nature. The ultimate and enduring legacy of this Zoroastrian ethical matrix for the Abrahamic traditions is the powerful and deeply resonant idea that the cosmos is, at its deepest and most fundamental level, a just and a moral place, a place where the choices that human beings make in the exercise of their God-given free will truly and eternally matter. The ancient and bleak world of the pre-Zarathustrian afterlife, a world of dusty and shadowy underworlds where the dead, both good and evil, shared a common and meaningless fate, was swept away, and in its place, there arose a new and magnificent vision of a universe that is a vast and perfectly calibrated instrument of divine justice, a universe in which every tear is counted, every sin is weighed, and every act of love and courage is treasured for all eternity. The Zoroastrian concepts of the Chinvat Bridge, the Dina, the House of Song, and the House of the Lie, which were, in their original context, the vivid and deeply logical expressions of the Prophet's radical, dualistic faith, were, through a long, complex, and often hidden process of cultural transmission and transformation, gradually and creatively absorbed into the eschatological frameworks of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, becoming the familiar and beloved landscapes of the Western religious imagination, the heavenly gardens and the fiery pits that have inspired and terrified the faithful for over 2,000 years. The Zoroastrian matrix was not the only source of these ideas, and the later traditions, as we have seen, brought their own unique and divinely revealed truths to bear upon the ancient Persian model, transforming and enriching it in ways that the prophet Zarathustra could never have imagined. But the foundational and enduring insight, the insight that the afterlife is not an arbitrary reward or punishment, but the direct and inevitable consequence of the moral life, a life that is lived in every moment under the watchful and loving gaze of a just and all-knowing God, is an insight that belongs, first and foremost, to the ancient Persian sage, and his voice, which still echoes across the millennia, is a permanent and unconquerable part of the spiritual and moral heritage of humanity. The heavens and the hells of the Abrahamic West are, in the end, a magnificent and enduring monument to the prophetic genius of Zarathustra, a genius that gave the world its most powerful and most enduring, map of the eternal soul, and that continues, to this day, to illuminate the path of righteousness, and to warn, with a terrifying and loving clarity, of the abyss that awaits those who choose the darkness. The Zoroastrian heaven and hell were the great and original matrix, and the Abrahamic world is the magnificent and glorious cathedral that was built upon its foundation. The complex and deeply nuanced narrative of the Zoroastrian influence on the Abrahamic afterlife is not, however, without its passionate and often highly critical scholarly detractors, and the history of this academic debate is a fascinating and important part of the story, a reminder that the study of ancient religion is rarely a matter of simple and indisputable facts. For much of the 20th century, and particularly in the decades following the Second World War, a powerful and influential school of thought, often associated with certain strands of Protestant and Catholic biblical scholarship, sought to minimize, or even to deny, any significant Zoroastrian impact on the development of the Jewish and Christian eschatologies. These scholars, who were often motivated by a deep and understandable desire to protect the unique and revealed character of the biblical faith from any taint of pagan or syncretistic influence, argued that the striking and numerous parallels between the Zoroastrian and the Abrahamic systems could be adequately explained by a variety of other means, a common and shared cultural heritage in the ancient Near East, a parallel and independent development of similar ideas in response to the universal human problems of suffering and death, or even, in some cases, a later and reverse influence, with Zoroastrianism, in its final Pahlavi form, borrowing from the already established Christian and Jewish traditions of the Sasanian period. The dating of the relevant Zoroastrian texts was a central and fiercely contested battleground in this scholarly war, with the skeptics pointing to the relatively late date of the Pahlavi writings, such as the Bundahishn and the Artavarufnama, which were compiled in the 9th and 10th centuries CE, centuries after the rise of Islam, and arguing that any apparent parallels with earlier Jewish and Christian texts were, therefore, likely to be the result of Zoroastrian borrowing from those sources, rather than the other way around. The debate was, and remains, a complex and highly technical one, involving the skills of linguists, textual critics, and historians of the ancient Near East, and it has generated a vast and often contentious body of scholarly literature, a literature that is a testament to the profound and enduring importance of the questions at stake. The origins of heaven and hell are, for many, not just a matter of academic curiosity, but of fundamental religious and cultural identity. However, over the course of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, a powerful and increasingly compelling scholarly consensus has emerged, a consensus that, while still acknowledging the complexity of the evidence and the need for caution and nuance, firmly and decisively affirms the reality and the significance of a deep and formative Zoroastrian influence on the eschatological development of the Abrahamic faiths. This shift in scholarly opinion has been driven by a number of crucial and interlocking factors. The careful, linguistic dating of the Avestan Gathas, the oldest and most sacred Zoroastrian texts, to the late Bronze Age, between 1500 and 1000 BC, has established, beyond any reasonable doubt, the extreme antiquity of the core Zoroastrian concepts of Asha, the Druj, the Chinvat Bridge, the House of Song, and the House of the Lie, concepts that predate by many centuries any comparable developments in the Hebrew Bible. The growing appreciation of the profound and pervasive cultural and political power of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, the world's first true superpower, and of its deep and sustained impact on the Jewish community during the crucial, formative period of the Second Temple, has made it increasingly difficult to dismiss the influence of the dominant imperial ideology on the subject. Peoples who lived under its rule, an ideology that was, as we have seen, saturated with Zoroastrian religious and ethical concepts, and a more sophisticated, and less polemical, understanding of the processes of cultural and religious exchange in the ancient world, an understanding that recognizes that influence is not a simple matter of passive borrowing, but a complex and creative act of adaptation and transformation, has allowed scholars to see the relationship between the Zoroastrian and the Abrahamic traditions not as a threat to the integrity of either faith, but as a fascinating and mutually illuminating dialogue across the centuries. The ancient Persian matrix of the afterlife is no longer, for the vast majority of secular historians of religion, a matter of mere speculation. It is a well-established and deeply significant historical reality, a reality that has transformed our understanding of the very origins of the Western religious imagination. The careful and historically responsible approach to the study of this complex and deeply significant cultural transmission is not merely a matter of academic accuracy, it is essential for a proper appreciation of the true and profound genius of all the traditions involved, and for a deeper and more nuanced understanding of the nature of religious and cultural change. The Zoroastrian Magi, who preserved and elaborated the ancient eschatological wisdom of their prophet for over 1,000 years, were not mere passive conduits of a dying and irrelevant tradition. They were the active and creative guardians of a magnificent and deeply sophisticated spiritual cosmos, a cosmos that was, in its own right, one of the most impressive intellectual and ethical achievements of the ancient world. The Jewish scribes and prophets who, in the crucible of the Babylonian exile and the Persian period, absorbed and transformed these Zoroastrian ideas, were not imitators or plagiarists. They were the inspired and brilliant authors of a new and enduring vision of the one, God's justice and mercy, a vision that was built, with the aid of the Persian tools, upon the solid and unshakable foundation of the covenant with Abraham and the Torah of Moses. And the Christian apostles and the Muslim prophets, who in their turn inherited and further transformed this ancient and evolving eschatological tradition, were not syncretists or borrowers. They were the messengers of a new and world-changing revelation, a revelation that gave a new and eternal meaning to the ancient and universal human hopes and fears about the soul's final destiny. The story of the Zoroastrian matrix of heaven and hell is not a story of theft or of contamination. It is a story of a magnificent and enduring human conversation about the most profound and the most important questions of existence, a conversation that has been carried on across the boundaries of language, culture, and empire for over 3,000 years, and that continues to this day to shape the beliefs, the values, and the ultimate hopes of billions of people across the globe. The ancient Persian voice of Zarathustra is still a vital and a speaking part of that great and eternal dialogue. The legacy of this long and complex process of cultural transmission is not only to be found in the dusty, scholarly volumes of comparative religion, but in the very fabric of the modern, Western, moral and spiritual consciousness, a consciousness that has been, in ways both seen and unseen, profoundly and permanently shaped by the ancient Persian vision of a universe of moral cause and effect. A universe in which the soul is the architect of its own eternal destiny. The ideas of a personal judgment after death, of a heaven and a hell that are the direct and proportional consequences of one's earthly actions, of a divine scale that weighs the soul's deeds, and of a final and absolute separation between the righteous and the wicked, are not merely the doctrines of specific religious traditions. They are the fundamental and often unspoken assumptions of the entire Western ethical framework, the framework that underlies our concepts of justice, of personal responsibility, and of the ultimate meaning and purpose of a human life. The Zoroastrian heaven and hell, which were, in their original context, the brilliant and logical expressions of a radical and demanding ethical dualism, have become, through the long and winding channels of history, the very architecture of the Western soul, the invisible and eternal, scaffolding that shapes our deepest fears and our highest hopes, our sense of right and wrong, and our unshakable conviction that the choices we make, in the quiet and hidden chambers of our own hearts, truly and eternally matter. The ancient Persian prophet, who once sang his sublime and lonely hymns on the windswept steppes of Central Asia, is still speaking to us today in the language of the heavens and the hells that he was the first to imagine, a language that has become the native tongue of the spiritual imagination of half the world, and that continues to guide, to inspire, and to warn the human soul on its long and perilous journey toward the eternal and unconquerable light. The modern and enduring relevance of the Zoroastrian eschatological matrix, the ancient and powerful vision of paradise and hell that we have been tracing throughout this documentary, lies not only in its profound historical influence on the Abrahamic faiths, but in the direct and challenging questions it continues to pose to the modern, secular, and often deeply, morally confused world. We live in an age that has, in large measure, officially abandoned the traditional, religious concepts of a final judgment and a post-mortem reward or punishment, an age that is characterized by a pervasive and often unquestioning moral relativism and a deep and unsettling sense of personal powerlessness in the face of the vast and impersonal forces of global economics, climate change, and political corruption. The Zoroastrian vision of the universe, a vision of a cosmos that is, at its deepest and most fundamental level, a moral and a just place, a place where every single action, no matter how small or how hidden, has a definite and eternal consequence, and where every individual human being, through the exercise of their own God-given free will, is the sole and absolute author of their own eternal destiny, stands as a powerful and deeply countercultural challenge to the prevailing and often dispiriting assumptions of our time. The Chinvat Bridge, the razor's edge of truth that separates the saved from the damned, is not for the modern Zoroastrian or for those who are inspired by this ancient wisdom, a piece of quaint and outdated mythology. It is a powerful and urgent symbol of the absolute and non-negotiable reality of personal responsibility, a symbol that calls us, in every moment of our existence, to make a conscious and deliberate choice between the path of truth and the path of falsehood, the path of light and the path of darkness, and to accept, with courage and with humility, the eternal and inescapable consequences of that choice. The Zoroastrian heaven and hell are not, in this profound and deeply ethical perspective, merely destinations that await us after death. They are the living and present realities that we are constructing, day by day, thought by thought, deed by deed, in the silent and hidden workshop of our own souls. The ancient Persian message is a message of radical hope and of terrifying warning, a message that is as urgently relevant to the struggles of the 21st century as it was to the world of the prophet Zarathustra over 3,000 years ago. The Zoroastrian emphasis on the sanctity of the material creation and the active and joyful duty of the human being to participate in its purification and its renewal, which is, as we have seen throughout this series, a central and inseparable dimension of the faith's eschatological hope, also offers a powerful and deeply relevant ethical framework for confronting the most pressing and the most existential crisis of our own time, the global environmental catastrophe that threatens the very future of life on our planet. The Zoroastrian vision of the Frashokereti, the final and glorious renovation of the world, is not a promise of a distant and otherworldly escape from a doomed and corrupted earth. It is a call to action, a sacred and urgent duty to begin the work of that renovation, here and now, in the physical and tangible reality of the world that Ahura Mazda has created and that he has entrusted to our care. The Zoroastrian faithful, who for millennia have striven to protect the purity of the water, the earth, and the fire, and who have regarded the pollution of these sacred elements as a grave and demonic, sin, were the pioneers of a profound, and deeply, practical, environmental, ethic, an ethic that is more desperately needed today than ever before in human history. The Zoroastrian heaven is not a realm that is achieved by escaping from the material world. It is a realm that is built, and that is made manifest through the active and loving purification and perfection of that world, a purification that is, simultaneously, a purification of the human soul. The ancient Persian map of the afterlife is, in this sense, a map for the living, a guide for how to live a life of purpose, of responsibility, and of joyful and courageous service to the good creation, a life that is, in every moment, a conscious and deliberate preparation for the final and glorious crossing of the Chinvat Bridge, and a contribution, however small, to the ultimate and certain victory of the light over the darkness, the truth over the lie, and the life over the death. The Zoroastrian heaven and hell, the original and the most enduring matrix of the Western afterlife, are not just the destinations of the dead. They are the eternal and unconquerable symbols of the choices of the living, choices that are being made right now in the silent and secret chambers of every human heart, choices that will determine, for all eternity, whether we walk with joy into the light, or whether we fall with terror into the abyss. The enduring and universal appeal of the Zoroastrian eschatological vision, the reason it has been able to speak with such power and such persistence to the human soul across 3 millennia of radical, historical and cultural change, lies in its profound and deeply satisfying commitment to the ultimate and absolute justice of the cosmos, a justice that is not an arbitrary, divine decree, but the direct, inevitable, and mathematically precise consequence of our own freely willed actions. The Chinvat Bridge is the ultimate and the most terrifying symbol of this moral physics, a physics that is as certain, as predictable, and as inescapable as the law of gravity, a physics that treats the king and the peasant, the rich man and the poor man, the powerful and the weak, with absolute and impartial equality. The soul, in the moment of its final judgment, is stripped of all social status, all earthly wealth, and all political power, and it is measured with a terrifying and exact precision solely by its own intrinsic moral worth, the quality of its own freely chosen thoughts, words, and deeds. This radical and profoundly democratic vision of a cosmic justice that is accessible and equally applicable to all, regardless of their worldly station, is one of the great and enduring gifts of the Zoroastrian faith to the human race, a vision that has helped to shape the fundamental Western concepts of the rule of law, of personal responsibility, and of the inherent dignity and the ultimate accountability of every human soul. The Zoroastrian heaven and hell are, in this sense, the great cosmic equalizers, the eternal and unchanging reminders that the true worth of a human being is not measured by the size of their bank account or the power of their office, but by the content of their character, the truthfulness of their words, and the love and the courage that they have poured into the world through their good deeds. The ancient Persian prophet taught that the soul's final and eternal home is not a matter of luck, of privilege, or of divine caprice. It is a matter of choice, and that choice, the most important and the most terrifying choice that any human being can ever make, is placed by the wise Lord himself, directly and inalienably, into the hands of every individual, man, woman, and child. The Chinvat Bridge is the ultimate and eternal testament to the Zoroastrian faith in the power, the dignity, and the absolute and terrifying responsibility of the human free will, a free will that is the greatest gift and the greatest burden that a loving and a just God could bestow upon his creation, a free will that is the very engine of the cosmic drama, and the sole and ultimate determinant of every soul's eternal and unchangeable destiny. As we come to the end of this long and deeply profound journey into the heart of the Zoroastrian afterlife, and as we step back from the terrifying and magnificent edge of the Chinvat Bridge, we are left with a sense of awe at the ancient, ethical genius that constructed this ultimate and eternal tribunal of the soul. The Zoroastrian vision of paradise and hell, of a house of song and a house of the lie, was not a late, superstitious accretion added by a corrupt priesthood to frighten the masses into submission. It was, from its very inception, in the sublime and intensely personal hymns of the prophet Zarathustra, the logical, the ethical, and the philosophical culmination of a radical, new way of understanding the cosmos, the human person, and the divine. The universe, in this profound and revolutionary conception, was not a chaotic and amoral playground of capricious gods, but a fiercely contested and deeply meaningful battleground between the forces of truth and falsehood, order and chaos, light and darkness, a battleground in which every human soul, through the exercise of its own God-given free will, was an active and indispensable soldier. The afterlife was not a vague and shadowy realm of dust and silence, but a perfectly just and meticulously structured system of rewards and punishments, a system that was the direct, inevitable, and self-created consequence of the choices that were made in the quiet and hidden chambers of every human heart during the long and demanding years of the earthly life. The Zoroastrian heaven and hell were, in the truest and deepest sense, the eternal and magnificent mirror of the self, a mirror that reflected, with a terrifying and absolute clarity, the face of the person one had truly and irrevocably become, a face that was, for the righteous, the radiant and beautiful face of the divine, and for the wicked, the hideous and terrifying face of the demonic. The Chinvat Bridge was the great and final crossing, the moment of ultimate and inescapable truth, from which there was no appeal, and from which there was no escape, for all eternity. This magnificent and deeply logical Zoroastrian eschatological system was not destined to remain a purely local Iranian phenomenon, confined to the remote fire temples of the Persian plateau. The rise of the Achaemenid Empire, the world's first true superpower, transformed the faith of Zarathustra into the dominant religious ideology of the largest and most diverse empire the world had ever seen, and it brought the Zoroastrian magi, with their ancient wisdom and their elaborate rituals, into direct and sustained contact with the subject peoples of the Near East, most notably the Jewish community, which was in the midst of its own profound religious and intellectual transformation. As we have traced through the centuries of the Second Temple period, the Zoroastrian concepts of a final judgment, a bodily resurrection, a messianic savior, a cosmic war between a good God and a powerful devil, and a clear and decisive separation of the righteous, who are rewarded with eternal life in a heavenly paradise, and the wicked, who are condemned to the eternal torments of a fiery hell, flowed, like a powerful and invisible subterranean river, into the very heart of the developing Jewish tradition, and from there they poured, with an unstoppable and transformative force, into the emerging faiths of Christianity and Islam. The Zoroastrian matrix, the ancient and original map of the afterlife, which was first drawn, with such visionary clarity, by the prophet of the wise Lord on the windswept steppes of Central Asia, became the foundational and enduring blueprint for the heavens and the hells of the entire Abrahamic world, shaping the ultimate hopes and the deepest fears of billions of human beings across the globe and across the millennia. The Zoroastrian imagination had, in a very real and traceable, historical sense, given birth to the spiritual geography of half the world, a geography that is still, today, the dominant and the most powerful framework for understanding the ultimate destiny of the human soul. The enduring and universal lesson of the Zoroastrian heaven and hell, a lesson that transcends the boundaries of any single religious tradition and that speaks, with an undiminished power, to the modern, secular, and often morally adrift world, is the radical and deeply empowering message that every individual human being is, in the final and most profound analysis, the soul, an absolute author of his or her own eternal destiny. The Zoroastrian faith did not teach that the human person was a helpless pawn of fate, a victim of circumstance, or a creature whose eternal future was determined by the arbitrary whim of a distant and inscrutable God. It taught, with a fierce and uncompromising clarity, that the power to shape one's own soul, to build a bridge to the light or to dig an abyss of darkness, was placed by the wise Lord himself, directly and inalienably, into the hands of every individual, man and woman, a gift of immense and terrifying responsibility. The Chinvat Bridge is the ultimate and most dramatic expression of this profound and empowering truth, a truth that is as relevant and as urgent in the chaos and the confusion of the 21st century as it was on the sun-baked plains of ancient Iran 3,000 years ago. The bridge is a constant and silent reminder that the life we are living today, in this very moment, is the raw material of our eternity, that every thought we think, every word we speak, and every deed we perform is a stone that we are laying, with our own hands, on the foundation of our own eternal and unchangeable future, a future that will be, at the moment of our death, revealed to us, with an absolute and terrifying clarity in the form of the Dina, the mirror of our own true and self-created self. The Zoroastrian judgment of the soul is not a distant and mythological event, it is a continuous and ongoing process, a process that is taking place right now in the silent and hidden chambers of every human heart, and the Chinvat Bridge is the ultimate and eternal symbol of the profound and inescapable truth that we are, in the end, precisely what we have chosen to be, and that our choices, and our choices alone, will determine, for all eternity, whether we walk with joy into the light, or whether we fall, with terror, into the abyss. This is the ancient and eternal wisdom of the Zoroastrian heaven and hell, a wisdom that is, and will forever remain, the great and enduring gift of the prophet Zarathustra to the spiritual and moral heritage of humanity. Thank you for joining me on this profound and deeply illuminating journey into the heart of the Zoroastrian afterlife, the great and original matrix of paradise and hell that shaped the eschatological imagination of the Western world. We have traveled from the ecstatic hymns of the prophet Zarathustra on the ancient steps to the magnificent palaces of the Achaemenid kings, and from the visionary texts of the Sasanian Magi to the pages of the Bible and the Quran, tracing the hidden and powerful river of Persian spiritual genius as it flowed across the centuries into the very core of the Abrahamic faiths. If this exploration of the ancient and eternal questions of judgment, heaven, and hell has sparked your own curiosity and has given you a new perspective on the deep and interconnected history of our world's religions, please take a moment to show your support. Hit the like button, share this video with a friend who is fascinated by the big questions of life, death, and what comes after, and subscribe to the channel, ringing the notification bell so that you never miss a new deep dive into the stories of our history. I always look forward to reading your own thoughts and your personal reflections in the comments below. Your engagement and your curiosity are the fuel that keeps this channel alive. I hope you enjoyed this content, and I'll see you in the next video.